It's time for revival. Today I want to talk to you about the revival that happened in the Cambodian refugee camps. But before I get there, I thought I better tell you how I got to the refugee camps to begin with. My story starts in 1977 after I graduated from high school. I went to Montana and I was so lost, so confused, and I ended up working with a Hell's Angel who told me that there is no God, and there is no purpose for life. And I became so depressed, thinking that there is no purpose in life, there is no God. And I had problems with my two best friends. Their lives were being destroyed by drugs. And I thought, I wanted to help them. I wanted them to have some purpose in life. But their lives just kept going worse and worse. And I became so depressed that I decided that if it's right, there is no purpose in life, that there is no God, I thought, I don't want to live anymore. So I thought that day, I'm going to end my life. But I always believed that there was a God up in outer space someplace. I celebrated Christmas every year. Emmanuel, God with us. God's Son born into this world. And somehow deep down in me, I believed it, that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. But I had no relationship. And what I saw around me, my family was not a very happy family. And I didn't have a Christian upbringing. So I had no understanding that there was a real God who loved me. And so I thought, I'm going to give God a chance before I kill myself. If he's real, he needs to show me today. So I was out and early in the morning, looking up in the clouds. It was a cloudy day. And I said to God, first time to pray, if you are there, I want to know today. Because if it is true, this Hell's Angel, what he said, that you don't exist, and whatever makes you happy, you have to do it today because tomorrow you die and it's over with. I thought, I don't want to live anymore. But if you are there, Lord, show me today. And the clouds opened up and the sun was shining on me like a bright light. And I didn't hear any voices and I didn't see anybody. But the Bible talks about a peace that passes all understanding. A peace that you can't understand with your natural mind. This peace came over me for the first time in my life. And I knew that there was a God. God saved my life. And so I thought, how do I find this God? But I knew that there was a book called the Bible that talks about God. So I went down to the bookstore and I got this Bible in 1977. This book changed my life. So I got it and I started to read it day and night. And I started to find out who God really was. And I just put a little advertisement from the beginning that this book transformed my life. And this book is the one that tells us all about what God's will is. All about our plan, God's plan for our lives. How we can be forgiven from all our wrongdoings and sins. And so I started to read this book and God transformed my life. And I just want to, from the very beginning, say that this is the book. And during this teaching, I will be talking about how God speaks to me. And God has never spoken to me with an audible voice. So I've never heard the voice of God in a way that rings in my ears. But God speaks to me every day through the Bible. The Bible is the light unto our path. It's what helps us to see what God's will, what his plan is for our lives. So I just give that advertisement, and I just want to share that the Bible is the best educational book in history. In Finland at one time, it was the bestseller. And in the world, it still is. In the whole world, the Bible is still the best-selling book. So I want to advertise it. If you don't have a Bible, you better get one. And I've been to Jyväskylä, where the Bible was taught from the beginning of education by Mika Agricola. He taught the first teachers in Finland how to teach from the Bible. And the world, all around the world, people understand that Finland has had one of the best educational systems in the whole world. And they wonder why. Well, if you start with the best book, you'll end up with the best results. So that's a good advertisement for you. Get your Bible. Don't just read it, but like it says in Psalm chapter 1, meditate on it day and night, and you will be like a tree planted by the waters, who will not, your leaves will never wither, and your roots will always be, you will be always green, and you will bear fruit in season. That's what happens when you meditate on God's word. And as I meditated on God's word, God speaks to me every day. And so I wanted to know this God who saved my life. And I thought that God was in the church building. So I went to this Pentecostal church in Montana. And that's where I started to be taught the Word of God. And my life started to be transformed by the Word of God. And I thought, I wanted to become a forest ranger. In Montana, they have big mountains and lots of grizzly bears. You've probably heard of Yogi Bear. Hey, boo-boo, let's go get a picnic basket. The bears would go and they would steal food from the campers in Yellowstone Park. And so I wanted to be one of these, these rangers who took care of the trees and the bears in the forest. But I decided that after God met me and after I got saved, that I didn't want to do that anymore. I wanted to know God and what God's will was for my life. So I thought, how do I do that? So I was reading the Bible and I looked at the book of Esther. And if you know the book of Esther, she told all the Jewish people not to eat or drink for 3 days because the king was going to kill all the Jews in their time. And because all the Jewish people fasted and prayed for 3 days, they did not eat or drink, God saved the whole nation. And the one who was trying to kill the Jews, his life was taken instead. And God prospered the Jews. He made them not only be saved, but that God used the Jewish people. And the plan was from the beginning in the Bible. If you read about Abraham, God promised Abraham that from your seed, every nation, every tribe on earth will be blessed. God wants to bless all the nations of the world, all the people groups, all the refugees, everybody. And he will do it through the promise that he made to Abraham. And we are Abraham's offspring as we believe, as we're born again by faith. It was faith. Abraham went to a new country. He just listened to what God said and he obeyed. And God blessed Abraham because of his faith. And we become children of faith when we also do the same. When we listen to what the Bible says, what God is speaking. Jesus said, go into all the world and preach the gospel to all people, that all men would become saved. God's will is that all would be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth, which is in the Bible. And so that's God's plan for us, is that we would go into all the world. And so I wanted to know, okay, God, where do you want me to go? What do you want me to do with my life? And so I was, after reading Esther, I thought, well, Esther went 3 days without eating or drinking. So I thought that's when God listened and God answered their prayer. So I decided to go 3 days without eating or drinking and just to ask God to pray. So I did that. I went 3 days without eating or drinking, and I was just sitting before God in this church, waiting for him to speak to me. And back then, I thought that, either God will come or an angel will come and speak to me, because I thought that that's how God speaks. So I was sitting on my knees in this church, asking God, God, what do you want me to do with my life? And I waited and I waited and I looked around if there was an angel or, if God was there. Nobody came. Then I ended up falling asleep on the altar. And I woke up and there was no God, no angel. So I came back the next night and I was doing the same. For 3 nights I did that. And no angel came. God did not come. And I was wondering, okay, how does God speak? And then at the very end of that fasting of 3 days, I saw a vision. And I wasn't asleep this time. I was actually awake. And I saw these starving people. I didn't know who they were or where they were, but they were Asian-looking people. And they were walking around like skin, with bones and skin, and they were starving to death. And I couldn't understand what I was seeing. To me, it was just, I'd never seen anything like it. I was only 17 years old, and I didn't watch the news. I didn't know that there was starving people around the world. But here I was seeing this with in this vision of these starving people. And I couldn't believe, if God really loves everybody, how he can allow people to starve to death because they don't have enough food. I always had all the food I wanted. I never had to miss a meal in my life. And these people are starving to death because they have no food. So I asked God a question when I was having this vision. If you love these people, why are you allowing them to starve to death? And then the Lord spoke to me, not into my ears, but through this vision, that the important thing is not that these people have food, but that they know me. Mark, will you go tell these people about me? And then the vision was over. And I said, yes, I will go to these people. But I don't know where they are. Where are they? How do I go there? I had just become a believer. Just become a Christian. How do I go these people that God's calling me to? So I went to my pastor's house and I asked my pastor, I told him about this vision that God gave me. And I asked him, I said, how do I go to these people? And he said, well, Youth with a Mission is a good organization, and they train people, they disciple people, and then they send them to these kind of people who have never heard about Jesus before. And so I thought, okay. And it just happened to be that the leader of Youth with a Mission in Montana was at his house at that very minute, at that time. And so he said, you can talk to Dean Sherman. He's here. You can talk to him. So I asked this YWAM leader, I told him about my vision. I said, how can I go to these people? And he said, well, we're having a discipleship training program, a DTS, starting in 3 months. You can come there. And so I sold my truck and my skis and my surfboard, everything I had, to go to this discipleship training school in Montana. And so my life was being transformed in this school. And then for our outreach, we went to Mexico. And there was a lot of starving, or not starving people, but poor people living in houses made by cardboard, really poor. And so I was looking for starving people, but I couldn't find any. And so I was wondering, okay, God, where are these starving people that you want me to go tell about you? And then we ended up, after the outreach, I ended up going to California for the School of Evangelism, and another wonderful school with wonderful teaching us how to go out and share our faith with others, how to spread the good news. And then for our outreach in 1988, from that school, we went to Argentina for the World Cup football games, soccer games. And again, there was a lot of poor people in Argentina. But I didn't find any starving people. So all the time I'm saying, God, okay, where are these starving people that you showed me to go tell about? And then the outreach was over. I went back to California and I was wondering, okay, God, what do you want me to do now? And there just happened to be a ministry called Bibles for Mexico in the Youth of the Mission Base in California. So I joined this group, going to Mexico, giving Bibles from door to door. And we saw God move in a powerful way. But there was no starving people. I still was wondering, okay, God, you didn't call me to give Bibles from door to door in Mexico, but you called me to these starving people. Where are they? And then we went back to California from Mexico, and wonderful outreach. We saw God move in powerful ways. And then in 1979, on the news, there was these refugees coming out of Cambodia into Thailand, starving to death. And they were dying along the way. In between 1975 and 1979, about 2 million of these Cambodian people were either murdered or starved to death. But the world didn't know what was going on because the communists, when they took over the country, they put landmines all along the border. So nobody could go out of the country and nobody could come in. So there was no TV, there was no news. Nobody knew what was going on with these people for 4 years. But God knew what was going on. God sees everything. And His will that none would perish, but all would come to the knowledge of the truth. And so God was calling people to pray for Cambodia, even though they didn't know what was going on there. And then when the refugees started to come out of Cambodia, that's when the news hit the whole world and people started to pray and fast for these starving people and to go. And when I saw this on TV in California, I just started to weep. And I couldn't stop weeping because I knew that this is the people that God had called me to go to. And God said, go, tell these people about me. But I thought, I have no money. I had $200 US dollars. And I thought, how do I go to these people? I looked at the airplane flights and it costs $600 for an airplane ticket to go to Thailand. And I heard to work in these refugee camps, I needed $200 a month. And I had to at least work for 3 months. So I needed $600 to be able to work as a missionary in these refugee camps. And so I thought, how do I get $1,200? Actually all I needed is $1,000 because I had $200. And so I was praying and asking God, how do I do it? And He said, give. God loves a cheerful giver. I've learned that. And He said, give your $200 away and I will get you there. And I thought, God, I need 1,000 more, not 200 less. But I learned not to argue with God. So I said, okay. So in our youth and mission centers, missionaries are coming and going all the time, and they always need some money. So I gave my $200 for some of these missionaries that needed money. And then I said, okay, now what do I do, God? And then it came on the main news in the TV in America that anybody who wants to go work in these refugee camps, that the U.S. government will give you a one-way free ticket to go to work in these refugee camps. And it just happened to be that these flights would go, they would pick up refugees, turn around and come back, drop off the refugees, and then they would go back, a 747 jumbo jet, they would go back to pick up more refugees. So the plane was going straight back empty to get more refugees. So all I needed to do is get up to San Francisco and I can get a free one-way ticket to work in these refugee camps. And it just happened to be that somebody in our center their parents lived in San Francisco. And they said that I can get a ride with them. So I got a free ride up to San Francisco, but I still needed $600. I knew I had a free one-way ticket to get to the refugee camps, but I needed $600 for the first 3 months. And as we were eating with his family, I didn't tell that I needed that money, but his parents gave me $600. Never seen anything like that happen before. And so when I got on the airplane, I had enough money for the first 3 months to volunteer and work in these refugee camps. And so I got a free ticket with a whole section of a jumbo jet, free, with one other person. It was amazing. You know, I've never had it so nice since. God prepared a way for me to get to these refugee camps. You know, God called me to these camps. And we don't need money to follow God's call. We just need to obey what He tells us to do. And so I got to Thailand, and the leaders of Youth with a Mission in Thailand asked me to fill out a form saying, how long do I commit myself to work in the refugee camps? I thought that's interesting because I had a one-way ticket. I have no money to go home. But I thought, well, God called me here. He never said anything about going back. So I put 10 years on that application. And it's an interesting thing because I was there for 10 years working in these refugee camps. God was so faithful to provide all of my needs. And the first refugee camp I worked in was called Kawidang. It was the refugee camp where the refugees, they came from everywhere. And in this camp, there was about 140,000 refugees. And in the first year, we saw 10,000 of these Buddhist Cambodian refugees come to know Jesus Christ as their personal Savior. It was so amazing. And we had about 100 workers, missionaries, just with Youth in the Mission, working in these camps. There was several camps, but this was just one of them. And 10,000 came to Christ only in this camp alone. But this is the most famous camp because that's where things started happening. And so we had many doctors and nurses working in the camp. We had our own hospitals. We had a leprosy hospital that we ran. And my job was to teach the Bible. That's all I could do. So I was teaching the Bible and helping to disciple these thousands of Cambodian refugees that came to Christ. And so that's where it all started. And I'm so thankful to God that God allowed me the privilege to come into this camp and help disciple these refugees. And I was able to see God do incredible things in those refugee camps. But the United Nations, they were not happy that all of a sudden 10,000 Buddhists became Christians. And so the United Nations decided that they were going to kick YWAM, Youth of the Mission, out of the camp because they were so angry that all these Buddhists were becoming Christians, and they didn't like that at all. So we prayed. Every Wednesday night we prayed and fasted. And of course there was lots of other missionaries working in the camps too. So we would gather with the other missionaries and we prayed and fasted. And we prayed that God would either change the heart of this UN leader or that he would remove him from the refugee camp. And that UN leader happened to go out of the camp on some trip out of Thailand. And when he tried to come back into Thailand, the United Nations would not, or the Thai government would not let him come back into the country. And so God kicked him out of the camp. So we continued to work in these refugee camps for many years, discipling these thousands of Cambodians that came to know Christ. And we saw this God do miracles and signs and wonders. And I have lots of stories, and hopefully I have enough time in the next session to share some of these stories with you about what God did in these refugee camps. But it was a true revival. And revival can't go without reformation. First, revival is when people, they get saved and to come to know God. Reformation is discipling them to really come to know God and to love God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength. So, hallelujah. God is working in the refugees around the world even today. Bless you. Amen. Hello, friends. I want to talk to you about revival. I want you to know that revival is coming to Finland. And actually, it's already started. And that's what I'll be teaching about, is the little signs of revival that I've seen in the north, south, east, and west of Finland as I've been praying for every city and town in Finland and seeing what God is doing. God wants you to know. And this generation is a visual generation. And the young people, they want to see God moving. They don't want to just hear about it, what's happening in Africa or someplace else. They want to actually see it with their own eyes. And TV7 is going to bring this news to you that you can share, and that these young people can start to see that God is moving in a powerful way, even in Finland. And if you would like to support this ministry and get this visual generation, the messages that they can actually see what God is doing and get them understanding that God is moving right now, not just someplace in the future, then they will get excited and they will want to come and listen and come to know this Jesus that is moving around them. That young people are coming to Christ more than ever before in this nation. And we need to believe that this is the generation that is seeking after God. So they will show you how you can support this ministry of TV7. God bless you.